It is Indiana in the Morning, presented by First Commonwealth Bank, WCCS 101.1 FM and AM 1160. House Majority Leader Dave Reed was with us last hour talking about the state budget. Part of that, of course, and a major part of it, is the education funding formula. And we got into a discussion about school fund balances. And, well, we cited a report put out by the Commonwealth Foundation earlier this week about schools holding on to fund balances. Marc LeBlond is a senior analyst at the Commonwealth Foundation and joins us on the phone. Going to explain a little bit more. Good morning.
Good morning, Todd. Thanks for having me on. It's a beautiful day here in Harrisburg.
Yeah, and it is here as well. So we're going to send what we have today, over to you in Harrisburg for tomorrow, if that's okay by you.
Perfect.
All right, Mark, let's talk a little bit about the Foundation's report the other day. It had specifically to do with school districts holding large fund balances, and they might call them rainy day funds. They might have other names for them, but is it, well, let's put it this way. What is, in the Commonwealth Foundation's view, a correct fund balance in terms of its relationship to school districts' expenses in a given year?
Thanks, Todd. So the big point here is there's $4.5 billion in these so-called rainy day funds, and it counterbalances the narrative, of course, that schools are being gutted and that school funding has incurred draconian cuts, if you listen to Governor Wolf and others. But our view is it's really not for us to say what is appropriate district by district. The Auditor General, Eugene D. Pasquale, has said, once you have in your reserves greater than 20%, for instance, as a percentage of spending, then it raises an eyebrow, right? But really our point is to shed some light on it and to help with the need for transparency and accountability. So to really equip citizens to say, hey, go to your local leaders, go to your school board, question them, ask for answers. What's the money for? What is it there for? What's its purpose?
As we think about school districts and their ability to manage the funds, of course, there's so much uncertainty as to what the school district is actually going to have coming in. And they're trying to develop spending plans. The whole formula in Pennsylvania is very difficult to understand. And here we have these volunteer boards of school members, board members, and they're relying upon the expert advice that they're being given. It becomes an awful difficult task, doesn't it?
It certainly does, and it's a thankless job, right? I mean, if you do things right, who's going to praise you? If you do things wrong, of course, people are going to be on your backs. But the point is, for there to be this healthy dialogue between school boards and the citizens, and just this is taxpayer money, right? People should know what its intended use is.
In terms of fund balances and what those funds are used for, I think it's important to understand that we're not talking about construction costs for future projects. This is entirely separate from that, is it not?
It is technically. We don't have information as it relates to capital reserve funds. However, you do see instances where a certain amount of construction can be funded out of the general fund. So without getting too deep into the weeds, you do see this kind of shifting around where there are non-designated funds used for construction.
Figuring the school budget costs from the state budget standpoint and how the state is allocating funding to school districts. And one of the things in talking with Senator Don White about property tax reform and its role in school funding, Pennsylvania has so many different angles from which to approach it. Border counties have one view of it. Eastern half of the state has another view of it, and the western half. Coming up with the proper formula for funding schools in Pennsylvania has been really, really difficult, and the state still doesn't have an idea. Well, they have an idea, but they don't have a solid answer to it yet, do they?
Absolutely, Todd. So you're hitting on two things here, right? So there's the fair funding formula, which only applies to a very small percentage of basic education funding. So if you applied that to the entire pie, then we'd have more equity in terms of state aid distribution. But the other issue here, beyond how the funds are distributed, is spending, right? So this is the central root cause, right? Mm-hmm. So rather than getting at the solution, what's the central problem? And that's spending, and we can curb that through, for instance, the Taxpayer Protection Act.
What does that act specify?
So the Taxpayer Protection Act, this is a common-sense spending limit that will protect hardworking Pennsylvanians against Harrisburg spending addiction. It essentially ties spending growth to the rate of inflation and population growth over a 3-year period. And we have the votes for it in the Senate. It's passed the House already. But the need is really for citizens to contact their lawmakers to bring it up for a vote.
Okay. All right. So that makes a little bit of sense. If you've got the votes in both the House and the Senate, just convincing the leadership to bring it to the floor and get it moving is the next step in that process. Tell me a little bit about the idea of spending per student. We see wide disparities in spending per student in districts all across Pennsylvania. Even though they're public school districts, there are still districts that spend much less than other districts do on the education of their students.
So this is very true, Todd. And if you look at across the state, the average, of course, is approaching $18,000 per student. You've got in Philadelphia, for instance, if you take out the charter sector, the district is spending close to $24,000 per student. And so this really flies in the face of the narrative that ever more funding is needed, right? Is the money really the problem, or is there an allocation of resources here? And so we believe, if you introduce something like school choice, right, the money follows the child, that's the best way to resolve that equity issue.
And yet we know as well that school districts, particularly public school districts, are going to do battle against such a thing because of the idea that public schools are going to suffer at the hands of private schools, charter schools, and schools of that nature. And we can certainly see from their standpoint that they would look at a formula such as that as saying, that's taking money out of our pocket and giving it to people who already, since they're pursuing a private school education, can afford it.
You're right, Todd. That is the common narrative. The truth about school choice is it leads to efficiencies, right? The EITC program, Educational Improvement Tax Credit Program, Ed Choice did an audit, and this was back in 2014, but showing the program saved $1 billion. And so since then it's adding $200 million in savings to that. But these programs actually, they save the state money, they save districts money. In the case of education savings accounts, if it costs $19,000 to educate a student and the student receives, say, a $6,000 grant, the district is left with $13,000, but they no longer have the expense of educating the child.
So within the Commonwealth Foundation's purview, of course, you're advocating to the state legislature, the members of the General Assembly for your point of view. Obviously, on the other side, there is a point of view that they consider to be just as valid. Where do you see the whole school funding issue? What direction do you see it going in right at this moment?
Well, at this moment, it's trending upward. So if you look at school funding right now, in those reserve funds, in those rainy day funds, it's $4.5 billion. And it's really just a staggering number. The increase from last year is $139 million. So just from last year to this year, $139 million increase. So it's trending upward. But we have reason to be optimistic, right? Because we've seen the political landscape change in the past, where in 2015, pension reform, for instance, vetoed by the governor. 2017, he signed it. So these things can change, and we're very hopeful for the future.
All right. Well, we'll continue to follow it in Harrisburg, see how it goes. Don't know how elections work into this. This is an election year, and that obviously will maybe change the formula for the vote counts when we get to a new year, but we'll watch it for now. Mark, thanks so much for being with us this morning.
Thanks, Todd. Appreciate the opportunity.
All right. You have a great day.
You too. Take care.
It's 8:56 in the morning. It's Indiana in the Morning, presented by First Commonwealth Bank here on WCCS 101.1 FM and AM 1160.